Hi, welcome to the Fundraising Growth Strategies Summit. My name is Brooke Richie-Babbage, and I am particularly excited to be talking with a dear friend of mine, Lauren Burke, today. Lauren is a founder of an amazing organization, a coach for emerging nonprofits, the winner of the Echoing Green Fellowship, the Skadden Public Interest Law Fellowship, 30 Under 30. She is just a social change extraordinaire and a whiz, really a creative genius at building institutions that have a major impact, social impact. So I'm excited to talk to you today, Lauren, to help everyone out there who's trying to also have a major impact think about fundraising. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Great. So what I wanted to focus on today is actually just sort of your wealth of experience and expertise, particularly in the area of bringing in resources to stabilize and grow nonprofits. You built your organization from a coffee shop with just you and some thought partners and interns to over $1 million in a really short period of time. And I would love to just do a deep dive into some of the wisdom that you gained along the way and have you share that. So let's start with, I'd love 3 pieces of advice that you have for fundraisers and organizational leaders and founders out there about how they should be thinking about fundraising.
Yeah. So I think, as many of us that are founding or starting nonprofits, when you're doing it, you're not doing it because you're necessarily like, oh, I really want to be a boss, I want to start an organization. It's because there's a need out there in the community and you're responding to that need. And for me, that meant that very early on, we were trying to do a lot with very, very little. And I think for me, like at the very beginning, I was like, oh, it shouldn't be that hard to raise $500,000. And then you realize, oh my gosh, this is really hard. And some of the more traditional areas of funding that you hear about are not going to be available to you right when you start off. You're not going to get necessarily foundations to write you $100,000 checks unless you're very well connected, which I was not. I have a lot of privilege in my life, but I wasn't like the niece of some foundational partner. So what we did at the beginning, and my first piece of advice, is just really be really scrappy. And so for me, that meant sort of, and I think that this really applies to what's happening in COVID-19 right now. It's almost like make a list of everything that you do have. And see if you can come up with a way to fundraise from that. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. So like our very first one at Atlas, I had a lot of friends that lived in New York City. And I knew when I grew up, I had tag sales all the time. And when I was living in New York City, I was a nanny. I nannied to put myself through law school. So I was a nanny in the West Village. And in the West Village, there were also lots of tag sales or stoop sales. So I spent a day, I rented a car and I drove around and gathered all my friends, like clothes they weren't using, books, furniture, like did many trips. And for a weekend, we had a tag sale, a stoop sale on the street in the West Village. And we actually raised over $3,000 that weekend, which was amazing. And that was just sort of like, okay, we have this, I have free labor, I have friends who will give me these things. Another scrappy fundraiser that we did is I had a lot of single friends. And so we did a speed date for a cause event. And we were like, okay, well, people want to meet other people. That's something they're willing to pay for. Because also at the beginning, you're not going to be able to like throw a gala and charge $50 for a ticket. But people were willing to pay $30 to meet singles for a night. And so I talked to a bar and I said, look, on a Tuesday night, I can fill your bar with 40 people. So they gave me the space for free and it didn't cost me anything to do the matching. And so that was another event that we did that raised a couple $1,000s. So I think that's my first big piece of advice, is just be scrappy.
What I love about those that I'll lift up, I mean, I just love them because they're fun. I love a good stoop sale and a good Tuesday night at a bar. But I will also highlight, for fundraising purposes, that they're both really low overhead.
Right.
And so part of what you are identifying in this sort of creative, scrappy, particularly in the early years, is you're not you shouldn't hold yourself to the standard of a big gala or even any sort of formal event where you have to pay for space and, have a ticketing system and food and cocktails. That you identified ways to bring in money by turning around or emphasizing resources that already existed.
Exactly.
Low-hanging fruit. And the second thing that's really interesting to note is when I was doing fundraising for my organization, I thought a lot about how do we do fundraising that is about our mission. And I think that's important, but also not everything you do has to be centered in mission. It can actually just be fun for the people that you want to bring into your ecosystem.
Right, 100%. And I would say, some of those people that came to the stoop sale, like we would have information about Atlas out there, so people that wanted to learn more could. And some of the people that came to the dating thing, we talked about board membership, but it really was at the beginning, and hopefully someone's talking about cultivation events, or we can talk about cultivation events. These were just very clear, like they cost me maybe $50. They cost me a lot of time, but maybe just $50. And we were able to raise thousands. And that was what was important at the beginning.
Excellent. So what's your second tip?
Yeah, so I think my second tip is be creative, which is similar to be scrappy. But so at Atlas, and this does go back to mission work, at Atlas, we really, our big thing was like, how do we teach undocumented young people about their rights? And at the beginning, we envisioned from the beginning, like this huge drop-in center where people could come, they could access lawyers and all these things. And of course, our first year budget was like $7,000. So we weren't going to rent a big space in New York City for that. But what I did think about, I was thinking, how are other young people getting information? And this was in 2011, 12. So like I won't say right when YouTube vlogging was coming up, because it probably was happening before then, but it was when people were really starting to do this sort of YouTube talk to the camera, here's my day in my life. So I started a YouTube channel, which again was totally free, where I was answering immigrant youth questions that they had. And it was something that not a lot of people were doing at that time, the sort of like, how do I provide legal information via YouTube? But that was a way for me to demonstrate to funders before we had any resources that we were doing work. Because I think the other thing that's tricky is that with so much competition with nonprofits, which is problematic and a whole other conversation, it's really hard to ask for funding when you haven't done anything yet. So the fact that you don't have resources is not exactly an excuse to not be offering programming if you're saying, I know the community needs this, I'm connected to the community, all of that. And so we actually got our first 5-figure grant from somebody who saw our YouTube video, because they were like, we are impressed that you're doing this. And that's what led us to our first really big community foundation. And so I think it's be creative in how you can demonstrate that you are doing some work, both for foundations that you're reaching out to, but also I'm sort of like if you build it, they will come sort of approach for funders.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely are. I think another thing that's really interesting about what you're saying ties to a conversation that I had with a woman named Claire Axelrad, also as part of this summit, about building relationships with donors. Mm-hmm. And sort of psychological triggers that fundraisers can tap into in building those relationships. And one of the things she talks about is authority and expertise, and the importance of translating the thing that we do know, which is our mission and our programs, into material and content and tools that show people what we're doing and that make them want to invest in us.
And I think sometimes we undersell or underplay. Like if you had the vision, for example, sorry, you can hear my dog barking in the background for sheltering in place. If you had the vision, for example, like I did, to like do in-person legal services for hundreds of people, you might think, oh, well, I'm not really doing that much if all I have is a YouTube channel. But we were able, YouTube counts, how many people view it. Instagram counts how many likes. Like there are tools that you can have that you can demonstrate. We've had over 2,500 unique views of this piece. And I think thinking about it in different ways is really important to quantify it also.
That's great. Thank you. So what's your third piece of advice?
My third piece is be fearless. I think I've been reading a lot of picture books to my nephew over the phone, so I'm realizing this is like, be scrappy, be creative, be fearless, but don't be afraid to put yourself out there. I think there's, it's definitely true that, again, if you do have connections, it's helpful. But just because you don't doesn't mean that you shouldn't go out there and cold call foundations and send letters of inquiry. It might not work right away, but if you're doing the work and you are helping your community, it will be heard eventually. And so, we got no's, we got rejected all the time, but but we also did get a lot of yeses. I have a friend who's doing like a raffle for an organization right now, and I was like, look, write a form letter, send it to 100 people. 70 people might say no, 80 people might say no, but that's 20 yeses, right? And so you have to make sure that you're not, if you just started, probably writing letters to the Gates Foundation, or at the beginning, everybody will be like, talk to Oprah, she loves these things. And you're like, okay. But look at your local foundations, ask if you can take them to coffee and just see if you can hear what they're interested in. All of that is really important. And if you're feeling like imposter syndrome, just ground yourself in that you are starting this because you saw a need. And so it's that quote, like, who are you not to be, like, fearless and amazing and all of that. So
Absolutely. That's really beautiful. And I think a lot of people, whether they are a founder or a new ED of an organization, or just at the helm, of an
yeah.
organization, you and I both know that that can be tough. And to remind ourselves to be fearless, to be out there. And that links a little bit to the second point that you made about being an expert, right? You know what you know. You know
Mm-hmm.
what the programs do, what you guys are good at. And showing that to people can probably or hopefully help push through fear.
Yeah. And I think also, like, if you're somebody who's maybe afraid, or you're going out to coffee with somebody and then they say, well, what do you need? That's the little hint to say, that you need funding. And if you're somebody who's afraid to say right off the bat, oh, I need $100,000 check, you can couch it in, $10,000 would be incredible. Here's what we can do with that. If you're able to do 50,000, this is what we would do with that. And if you know any foundations that would give $100,000, this is sort of what we could do with that. And so you don't, just because you're making a big ask doesn't mean you only have to be making a big ask. And oftentimes, like, you can get people excited to give more than they were anticipating by giving them those different levels and just letting that enthusiasm shine through.
That's a great strategy. That also links to another conversation that's part of the summit with Voulet. He talked about how, and you said this a little bit earlier, we sometimes undersell ourselves as nonprofit leaders. And he said, whatever you were thinking about asking in that conversation, add a zero. Right? And the strategy that you just mentioned, you can start with what you were sort of what feels safest, and then say, but with this extra zero, we could do this. That's a great tip. So I guess my last question for you is really about anything that fundraisers and leaders should keep in mind in our current circumstances. I've had conversations with a lot of leaders who are wondering, should I just be going out for every single dollar that I can find? I'm really terrified about going under. And if somebody's like, here's $10,000 to hand out food, I know we are an animal shelter, but should I hand out food? How do these things apply now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it goes back to being fearless, because you never want any of your fundraising decisions to be fear-based. And I think, at Atlas, like, we had a funder, for example, who was giving us funding, who then put out a political statement that we thought was very problematic. And we ended up returning a check to them, and being open and honest about the fact that we were returning a check, which then made another foundation double it because they liked, our chutzpah, which was great. But I think you have to, it's amazing how many people are trying to think of what can I do that's responsive in this moment. But it's so important that it is still grounded within your mission, because we will move past this point of time, like, hopefully with a kinder, more just, more equitable world. But when we look past this time, we as organizations and we as humans are going to be judged at what we did during this time. And so if you pivot your mission entirely and you don't think about the storytelling behind why that mission, why that pivot makes sense, right? So for example, if you're running an animal shelter that's now deciding to give out food, you could, if you're just doing that and a year from now somebody's like, well, you changed your mission in the wake of COVID, what if something else happens? I really care about giving money to animal shelters. You could, and I'm just flying off the cuff, you could think about like, well, we actually realized that being a food distribution point will get people to see the animals more. They're in isolation. They're seeing the animals that they could also take home with them when they're picking food. I mean, I don't know if that would work, but it has to be within the grand purpose of what it is that you're doing. Because again, we are starting, the best nonprofit founders are doing it because there was that need. And because COVID exists doesn't mean those other needs go away. And so if you're doing responsive work, just make sure it's a part of that larger mission storytelling piece.
Excellent.
Did you like how I pivoted that animal shelter to distributing food?
I think it's an example of your brilliance. I think that was great. And a really important point. It's, it's not that you can't go out for the money, but
right.
What's the story? What's the narrative arc that is consistent and that is true to the mission of your organization? Absolutely. Well, this was a great conversation. I think this was really concrete, helpful advice to nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. And I thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I will say, I also have a Google Doc of like resources of like tons of nonprofit fundraising resources. So if you want to add a link to it or whatever, people can email me and I'm happy to share it. It has like 200 links that I keep track of with nonprofit like tools, tips, and resources. So
absolutely. I will include that link on the Summit website so people can access it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.